There was a time when St. Mercy's Hospital was the epitome of progress and care. Built in the early 1900s, the hospital sat on a quiet hill, overlooking a small town like a silent patient guardian. Yet, as decades passed, St. Mercy's became infamous not for its healing touch, but for the darkness that lingered in its halls. The townsfolk whispered of the voices in the walls, a tale as disturbing as it was chilling. But those were only the rumors. No one knew the full truth of what happened inside St. Mercy's, not until I heard the story from the only living witness. A friend of mine, Lucas, was hired to clean out the hospital after it had been abandoned for years. It was a routine job, just sweep up debris, haul out old equipment, nothing more. But Lucas noticed strange things almost immediately. The unnatural chill that clung to certain rooms, the faint sound of whispering in the distance, and that gnawing feeling of being watched. By the second night, the emptiness of the building began to feel less like solitude and more like a prison, one with invisible eyes tracking his every move. The worst part, he said, was the third floor, a place no sane staff member dared to go. It was the old psychiatric ward, closed down after an investigation uncovered the mistreatment and abuse of patients. But the horror didn't end when the ward was shut. It only grew stronger, feeding on the suffering that had already soaked into its walls. On the fifth night, Lucas took a flashlight and, against his better judgment, ventured up to the third floor. He said the temperature dropped with each step, the air thickening with a stench he couldn't quite place. A door swung open on its own, and though every fiber in his being told him to run, he stepped forward. The sound of his boots echoed, each step heavier than the last. In the dim glow of his flashlight, he noticed scratches along the walls, hundreds of claw marks running down the hall, almost like a trail of agony and desperation. And then he saw her. Lucas said she appeared at the end of the hallway, her form partially shrouded by shadows. She wore a thin hospital gown, tattered and covered in dark, unidentifiable stains. Her head was bowed, the greasy strands of her hair hiding her face. He tried to move back, to flee, but his body wouldn't listen. His legs felt as if they'd been frozen in place. The figure lifted her head slowly, and Lucas saw her face. Hollow, empty eyes stared back at him. Her mouth was stitched shut with what looked like crude, homemade sutures, and her skin was mottled with bruises and cuts. She raised a trembling hand and pointed directly at him, a silent accusation. Lucas could hear a faint hissing in his mind, a whispered word over and over, "Help! Help! Help!" He backed away, tripping over debris, but every time he tried to blink, the figure seemed to shift closer, jerking toward him like a grotesque puppet. He turned to run, and that's when he heard a chorus of other voices, more of them, surrounding him. Faint at first, but growing louder. Laughter, crying, whispers that scratched at the walls of his sanity. He tried to make sense of the sounds, but they melded together in a chaotic symphony of suffering and despair. As he reached the stairwell, Lucas glanced back and saw more figures emerging from the rooms, each one worse than the last. Mangled bodies, some with twisted limbs, others with skin peeling from their faces, staring at him with eyes that held nothing but hatred. One figure, a young man in a straitjacket, crawled along the wall like a spider, his face contorted in a permanent scream. But none were as terrifying as the one who appeared last. He was an orderly, or what used to be one, dressed in a blood-stained uniform with deep, dark hollows where his eyes should have been. A sick smile stretched across his face as he walked toward Lucas, dragging a rusted scalpel along the wall, leaving a thin red trail behind. Lucas felt a hand brush against his arm, cold and skeletal. He spun around to see the woman with the stitched mouth inches from his face, her wide eyes filled with a desperation that seemed almost alive. She reached out, clawing at him, her muffled screams echoing in his mind. Finally, breaking free of his terror, Lucas bolted down the stairs. He could still hear the whispers and footsteps following him, relentless, like a dark tide rising to swallow him whole. When he reached the main floor, he thought he was safe, until he heard something that froze him in his tracks. It was his own voice, an echo of his laughter, his words. But the tone was twisted, mocking, like an imitation. The ghostly laughter filled the room, and Lucas watched as shadows pooled in the corners, forming shapes that mimicked his own movements, taunting him with distorted versions of himself. The hospital was playing with him, luring him deeper into its madness. Lucas ran for the exit, barely daring to breathe. He threw open the door, desperate for escape, but as he stepped outside, a blast of freezing air stopped him. The once empty field around the hospital was filled with figures, countless shadowy patients and staff, standing in silent ranks, watching him with hollow eyes. Their collective gaze pressed down on him, a suffocating weight that made his legs buckle. As Lucas stumbled away, he heard one final whisper, soft and chilling, emanating from the hospital itself. "We never leave." The days following his experience were a blur of feverish dreams and paranoia. Lucas told no one except me, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, waiting for him, trapped in that forsaken place. I urged him to leave the town, to put as much distance between himself and St. Mercy's as possible, but he refused. It was as if the hospital had planted a seed within him, a dark curiosity that refused to let him go. The last I heard from Lucas, he was planning to return. He said he needed answers, that he'd been dreaming of the stitched-mouthed woman and the whispers that called to him in the night. I tried to stop him, but he was already slipping, his mind unraveling like so many who had entered those cursed halls before him. They found his body a week later, just outside St. Mercy's, his face contorted in terror. The official report said he died of a heart attack, but I know better. When I saw his body, there were marks on his arms, tiny, thin lines, almost like stitches running up his wrists, and sometimes when the wind is just right, I think I hear it too. The faint, desperate whispers echoing from the hospital on the hill. "Help! Help!" The Old Mill Asylum sat at the edge of the town, decayed and forgotten. Locals avoided it, muttering stories of patients who had never left, of doctors who experimented on the mentally ill, and of voices that echoed long after the asylum closed. But one group of teenagers, eager to test the boundaries of fear, decided to explore it on Halloween night. Among them was Ethan, a skeptic who scoffed at ghost stories. He'd heard the tales of disembodied whispers and phantom screams, but he didn't believe any of it. However, as the group crossed through the rusted iron gates and saw the towering stone walls of the asylum looming above them, he felt a cold shiver run through him. It was darker than he expected. The walls seemed to swallow any light from their flashlights, leaving the rooms shadowy and suffocating. They began in the first hallway, where peeling paint hung like skin, and the air smelled of mold and something faintly metallic. Scattered across the floor were torn patient records, and a few wheelchairs, still rusted and creaky, sat abandoned. The deeper they ventured, the colder it became, as if the asylum itself was leaching the warmth from their bodies. Then they heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like footsteps shuffling across the ground. They froze, straining to listen. Ethan was the first to whisper, "Did anyone else hear that?" No one replied. The silence was thick, pressing against them until the dragging sound grew louder. The air felt thick with dread, and each breath felt harder to take. They continued forward, more slowly now, peering into rooms where forgotten beds lay overturned and dark stains streaked across the walls. Then, as they turned a corner, Ethan spotted something strange. At the end of the hallway was a door, partially open, spilling faint light into the darkness. The others saw it too, but no one wanted to approach. Ethan, determined to keep his skeptical edge, moved forward, pulling the door open. Inside was a small room lined with padded walls. Strangely, it looked clean, untouched by the years of decay. In the center of the room, chained to the floor, was a single tattered straitjacket. The straps dangled as if something had recently wriggled out of it. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at it, and when he blinked, he thought he saw the jacket twitch slightly, as if something invisible still wore it, struggling against its restraints. One of his friends, Claire, gasped, and Ethan turned to find her staring wide-eyed at the wall. Scrawled in fresh blood-red letters were the words, "Don't leave me here." It hadn't been there moments before. Panicked, the group bolted from the room and raced down the hallway, but the floor seemed to stretch, pulling them deeper instead of leading them out. Each door they passed seemed to throb and hum as if something was clawing to get out. The once empty asylum was now alive with the sounds of moaning and shuffling footsteps. Somewhere, a muffled voice began to whisper, low and pleading. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anguished, desperate, and growing louder. The voice seemed to come from all directions, filling his head with pain. Claire grabbed his arm, her face pale, and pointed to another door, the only one that wasn't rattling. They flung it open and scrambled inside, only to find themselves in an operating room. Old medical tools scattered across the floor, still gleaming. A rusted gurney stood in the center, its leather restraints stained a sickly brown. And lying on that gurney was a figure, strapped tightly, its body twisted in impossible angles. Ethan's flashlight flickered, but he saw enough to know this was no trick. The figure was almost skeletal, its skin stretched taut over its bones, its mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror. The same pleading voice filled their ears again, echoing, "Help me! Please help me!" Without warning, the figure began to move, jerking against the restraints, its body twisting and writhing. The sight was too horrific. Its limbs cracked as they contorted, bending in ways that defied nature. Claire let out a scream and bolted out the door, with the others following. But Ethan, still rooted in place, found his gaze locked on the figure as its head turned toward him, its hollow eyes meeting his. The pleading voice was clear now, but it didn't sound distant. It was inside his head, clawing at his mind. The words were sharp and invasive. "Come closer. Help me." The voice began to transform, shifting from a plea to a demand, its tone twisted with rage. "You cannot leave me here." Ethan staggered back, breaking free of the voice, and fled, joining his friends as they raced through the halls. But the asylum wasn't done with them yet. Doors slammed around them, and shadows began to pool in every corner, forming twisted, half-human shapes. One shadow, taller than the rest, stretched across the hallway and blocked their path. It was the doctor, or at least what had once been a doctor. He wore a stained lab coat and his face was hidden behind an old, cracked surgical mask, but his eyes gleamed with sadistic glee. In his hand, he held a bone saw, its edge jagged and dripping with fresh blood. Without speaking, he lifted the saw and took a step toward them, his movements jerky and unnatural. The group backed away, but as they turned, they found themselves surrounded. More figures, patients, nurses, and other shadowy entities filled the hallway, each one staring at them with blank, empty eyes, their faces stretched in agonizing expressions of horror. Desperate, they pushed through the shadows, racing down a series of hallways that twisted and turned, disorienting them. The whispers continued, echoing louder now, as if the walls themselves were crying out. Ethan could feel hands grabbing at him, cold and claw-like, scratching against his skin. They finally burst through a set of double doors and found themselves outside, gasping for breath, the asylum looming behind them like a dark predator. But as they stood in the moonlight, catching their breath, Ethan noticed something horrifying. Claire wasn't with them. Panicked, they looked back at the asylum, but the building was silent, its windows dark and lifeless. Claire's voice echoed faintly from within, calling for help. But the voice began to change, becoming deeper, twisted, echoing with that same malicious tone. "Come back. Don't leave me here." Despite his terror, Ethan knew what he had to do. He turned to go back, but something in the shadows seemed to shift, blocking his path. A cold voice filled his mind once more, softer now, more patient. "We'll be waiting." The next morning, the police found only 3 teenagers outside the asylum. None could remember the night clearly, nor could they explain why their arms bore bruises in the shape of claw marks, or why the asylum's walls were now marked with fresh blood-red scrawls that read, "Stay with us." They say the old Blackwell Sanatorium was cursed from the day it was built. Perched on a cliffside, surrounded by thick woods, it looked like something out of a nightmare. Blackwell closed down after a fire swept through the building in 1978, killing dozens of patients and staff. Since then, locals claimed the sanatorium's halls were haunted by the restless spirits of the patients who died within its walls. For years, no one dared enter, except, of course, for those who didn't know better. That's where I came in. A friend of mine, Amber, was a ghost hunter with a taste for dangerous places, and she'd been trying to convince me to join her for months. I finally caved one winter night, though I instantly regretted it when I saw the sanatorium up close. Even from a distance, it was terrifying. The windows shattered, doors barely hanging onto their frames, and that awful burned smell that never seemed to fade. The snow on the ground around it was untouched, as if even animals didn't dare come close. Amber led the way, clutching her flashlight and recorder, whispering about the things she'd read. They said patients had been chained to their beds, experimented on, forgotten. Her words only made the air around us feel colder, more stifling. Inside, the sanatorium was pitch black. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only glimpses of rusted bed frames, broken glass, and walls smeared with some kind of dark, unidentifiable residue. The deeper we went, the more I noticed a strange static in the air, like the crackling sound of an old radio. Faint but steady. Amber wanted to start on the third floor, the location of the psych ward, where some of the worst patients had been kept. The place was notorious for the brutality that happened there. Shock treatments, forced sedation, isolation rooms without light. The stories said that on cold winter nights you could hear the screams of patients as if they were still trapped there. We reached the third floor, and the temperature dropped so sharply I could see my own breath. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors that seemed to sag off their hinges. Amber looked at me, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and excitement. "This is it," she whispered, pulling out her recorder. She clicked it on and asked, "Is anyone here with us?" Silence. The only sound was our own breathing. Then, faintly, there was a creak, like a door opening down the hall. I gripped Amber's arm, my heart racing. "Maybe it's the wind," I whispered, though I wasn't convinced. There were no windows in the hallway. Every one had been boarded up. Amber moved toward the sound, and I had no choice but to follow. As we approached one of the rooms, my flashlight flickered, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving inside. I froze, staring, but it was gone as soon as it had appeared. Amber reached for the doorknob, and to my horror, it turned on its own, swinging open to reveal a small, dark room with a single rusted bed frame. There was a figure lying on it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a pile of blankets. But as I stared, I realized I could see fingers thin and pale resting on the edge of the bed. Then I saw a face, hollow and staring, with eyes that seemed to reflect no light at all. It was gaunt, with skin stretched tight over bones, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, pulling Amber with me, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the figure, her face pale. Are you one of the patients?" she asked in a shaky voice, holding her recorder closer. The figure moved, jerking up in a disjointed, unnatural way, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. It swung its legs over the edge of the bed and began to stand. That's when I noticed the shackles around its wrists, the iron chains trailing from them, scraping against the floor with an awful metallic sound. Amber took a step back, but she kept her recorder out. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure's head snapped toward her, and though its eyes seemed empty, I could feel it staring directly at us. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on us like a weight. And then, in a raspy, broken voice, it spoke. We were left here, forgotten, abandoned. The voice was layered, as if multiple voices were speaking through the same mouth, all twisted with pain and rage. I could barely breathe as I felt that fury clawing at us, dragging us deeper into the darkness. I reached out, grabbing Amber's arm. "We need to go. Now." But she didn't move. She was staring at the figure, entranced, as if caught in some invisible grip. The figure stepped closer, its chains rattling, and I could see its face more clearly now. Bruises, scars, and burns covered its skin, and its eyes were black pits, endless and hollow. Its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide, showing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Amber's recorder began to play back, though she hadn't touched it. A voice crackled through the speaker, one I didn't recognize, whispering, "You'll never leave. You'll never leave." In a sudden burst of desperation, I yanked Amber away from the figure. Her eyes snapped back to focus, and the terror on her face matched my own. We turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway as the sound of chains and laughter echoed behind us, following us, growing louder and louder. The shadows in the corners seemed to reach for us, stretching into skeletal hands that clawed at our clothes, our hair. We made it to the stairwell, but as we ran down, I saw something horrifying. Faces staring up at us from the darkness below, faces twisted in agony, with mouths open in screams that made no sound. Their eyes followed us, hollow and accusing, as if begging us to join them. When we finally burst out of the building, the freezing night air hit us like a slap. We didn't stop running until we were back in Amber's car, gasping for breath, hearts racing. But as we sat there, Amber's recorder clicked on again, even though she hadn't touched it. A voice whispered through the static, soft and mocking. "We're still waiting. You can't escape." Amber's face went pale as she realized what the voice was saying. She tried to turn off the recorder, but it wouldn't stop. The whisper continued, layering over itself a sinister chorus that grew louder and louder until it filled the entire car, rattling the windows. To this day, I don't know if we escaped that place or if part of it followed us. Amber stopped ghost hunting after that night. She wouldn't talk about it, and when I asked, she'd just stare at me with that haunted look in her eyes. She moved out of town a month later, leaving no forwarding address. Sometimes, though, late at night, my phone rings. When I answer, there's only static on the other end, followed by a faint voice whispering, "You'll never leave." It was the dead of winter when my sister Sarah decided to take a job as an overnight security guard at the old, abandoned Willow Ridge Children's Hospital. The place had been shut down in the 1960s after a scandal involving experimental treatments on young patients, and ever since it had loomed over the town like a silent, sinister shadow. No one went near it if they could help it, but Sarah needed the money, and she wasn't superstitious like the rest of us. The first few nights, she called me with updates. She laughed off the creaking floors and the occasional clang of an old pipe, chalking it up to a building that hadn't been touched in decades. But on her fifth night, she didn't call. I only found out what happened because she left me a series of messages on my phone, messages that would haunt me long after that night. In the first message, her voice was calm, but something felt off. She was whispering, "Hey, it's probably nothing, but I swear I saw something in the hallway outside the playroom. I'll call you back if it's anything." The second message came only minutes later. Her voice had changed. It was unsteady, tense. "I thought I saw a kid. He was standing in the hallway, just staring at me. But when I got closer, he was gone. I think it's just my mind playing tricks, right? Old buildings do that." The third message was frantic, her breathing ragged. "It's not in my head. I swear I'm seeing things. The lights keep flickering, and every time they come back on, I see more of them. Little kids just standing there. They're watching me. Oh God, one of them just smiled." That was when I called her back, but she didn't answer. I listened to the fourth message, hoping for some relief, but her voice was barely a whisper now. "They're gone. I don't know where they went." I turned around, and the whole hallway was empty again. "I'm going to the security office. I just need to sit down for a minute." Then came the fifth message, and I could hear the fear deep in her voice. I locked myself in the office. I can hear footsteps in the hall, but they're soft like little feet. They're trying to get in. I don't know why, but I feel like they know me, like they've been waiting for me. I can hear them whispering outside the door. I got in my car and sped over to the hospital, trying her phone over and over again, each call going straight to voicemail. I parked outside and made my way through the crumbling entrance. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of dust and decay. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and every step felt like I was walking deeper into something that had been waiting for someone like me. The hallway was lined with faded murals of children playing, their painted faces cracked and peeling, and every so often, I thought I saw eyes following me from those faded faces. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft echoes of my footsteps. When I reached the security office, the door was slightly ajar, but the room was empty. I tried calling Sarah's name, but my voice came out a hoarse whisper, swallowed by the thick, oppressive air. Her phone lay on the desk, the screen cracked as if it had been dropped. I picked it up, hoping it would hold some clue, but it was dead. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Down the hallway, something small and pale was standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My heart pounded as I lifted the beam and my blood ran cold. It was a little girl, no older than 6, wearing an old-fashioned hospital gown that hung from her like a shroud. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide, dark, empty. She stared at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. And then, without moving her mouth, I heard her voice in my head, as clear as if she'd whispered right next to me. "Are you here to play?" I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. As I did, she lifted her arm, pointing down the hallway toward the playroom. Slowly, more figures emerged from the shadows. Dozens of children, each one more ghostly than the last. their faces blank, eyes hollow. They moved in unison, watching me with expressions too empty for anyone who'd once been alive. I don't know what possessed me to follow them, but something about their eyes, their silent, eerie stares, felt like a compulsion. They led me down the corridor to the playroom, where a dozen dusty toys lay scattered on the floor, their colors faded with age. As I entered, a voice echoed around the room, childlike, yet twisted with something darker. She promised she'd stay with us. She said she'd come back. We waited. The temperature plummeted, and my breath came out in thick, visible puffs. I felt a chill brush against my neck, like the touch of cold, ghostly fingers. Turning, I saw a small boy standing inches from me, his face inches from mine. His eyes were blank, and his mouth hung open as if he were silently screaming. Then, all at once, the children began to move. They circled me, their faces contorted, each one staring at me with those terrible, accusing eyes. Their voices filled the room, whispering, overlapping in a horrific symphony of despair. She promised. She said she'd stay with us. You can't leave. The whispers grew louder, closing in, pressing against my ears until I thought my skull would crack. My body felt heavy, like the weight of every soul in that room was dragging me down. And then, just as my knees buckled, I felt something brush my arm. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, but she was alive. She grabbed my hand, and without a word, we tore down the hallway, the whispers following us, growing louder, filled with anger. Stay. Stay with us. We didn't stop until we burst through the entrance, slamming the doors behind us. Outside, the night air was a bitter relief, but the silence was worse. For a moment, we stood there, gasping, unable to process what had happened. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. They weren't just children. They were something else. They felt wrong, angry. We drove away without looking back, leaving that cursed building to its ghosts. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, Sarah found bruises on her arm, tiny handprints, as if dozens of small, cold fingers had been gripping her, trying to pull her back. She's had nightmares every night since, dreams of children crying, whispering her name, asking her to stay. Sometimes in the dead of night, she wakes to the sound of little footsteps outside her door, the soft giggles of children playing. And when she looks, the shadows seem to shift, as if something is watching from the darkness, waiting for her to come back. And every now and then, she swears she hears that same voice, whispering, "You promised." The St. Agnes Mental Institution was a place the town wanted to forget. Built in the 1900s, it was shut down after reports surfaced of inhumane experiments conducted on patients. It was rumored that some patients had died horrible deaths in the basement, but the files were sealed and the building had been left to rot. Most people avoided it, but for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt drawn to it, as if something inside had been calling me. One stormy evening, I decided to explore St. Agnes. I had a flashlight, a camera, and an odd sense of anticipation. The air was damp and heavy as I approached the building, lightning illuminating its twisted, broken windows. As I stepped inside, the air turned frigid, and an overpowering silence settled around me, almost swallowing the sound of the rain. The main hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors that led to small, empty rooms. The walls were covered in strange, smeared messages, but I couldn't make out the words. A broken wheelchair sat in the middle of the hallway, its wheels creaking as though it had just been moved. I told myself it was the wind, even though I knew it wasn't. I made my way deeper into the building, feeling like someone or something was watching me. I turned a corner and nearly screamed. A man, or what I thought was a man, was standing at the end of the hallway. He wore a white doctor's coat stained with what looked like blood, and his eyes were dark, empty hollows that seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. I blinked, and he was gone. Telling myself I was just seeing things, I decided to keep going. The basement was my destination, the place where all the rumors and horror stories pointed. I found the stairwell and hesitated. The stairs were narrow, covered in a layer of dust so thick it felt like I was descending into a tomb. Each step seemed louder than the last, and the air became even colder as I went further down. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, dark room with concrete walls. Old metal gurneys lined the sides, some with thick leather straps still buckled, as if they were waiting for patients to be restrained. There was a series of doors ahead, leading into what looked like cells. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low, tortured moan echoing from the far end of the basement. My heart pounding, I shined my flashlight toward the sound, my hands shaking. There, in one of the cells, a figure huddled in the corner, rocking back and forth. It was a woman, her hair long and tangled, her hospital gown torn and stained. I could barely breathe as I approached, torn between terror and the impossible urge to help her. As I stepped closer, she looked up, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. Her eyes were wide, but there was nothing human in them, just an endless black void. Her mouth stretched open, revealing a gaping, dark hole that went impossibly deep. The whisper that came from her mouth wasn't her own. It was a chorus of voices, each one filled with agony, as if all the spirits trapped in St. Agnes were speaking through her. "Help us. They hurt us. Don't let them leave us here." Her hand reached out, fingers long and skeletal, grasping for me. I stumbled back, feeling as though those voices had burrowed into my mind, filling me with their despair. My flashlight flickered, and for just a moment the entire basement seemed filled with shadows. Patients in ragged hospital gowns, doctors in blood-stained coats, nurses with hollow eyes, all staring at me. One of the figures stepped forward, a doctor, his face twisted into a wicked smile. "You wanted to know, didn't you?" he said, in a voice that was too close, though he hadn't moved an inch. "You came here looking for the truth." I couldn't move. My legs were frozen, and it felt like a weight was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The doctor's face stretched into something grotesque, his mouth opening wider, revealing rows of teeth that looked more like broken glass than anything human. He leaned closer, and I could feel his breath, icy and putrid, as he whispered in my ear, "You can't leave. You're one of us now." The basement door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I spun around, flashlight darting wildly, but all I saw were the endless black eyes of patients, doctors, and nurses closing in. They whispered, their voices clawing at my mind, filling me with a fear so deep it felt like my heart was being crushed. I turned and ran, my only thought to get out. I raced up the stairs, feeling their icy hands clawing at my back, pulling at my clothes, my hair. The whispers grew louder, begging, pleading, accusing. They wanted me to stay, to share in their endless torment. I burst into the main hallway, gasping for air. The whispers faded, but I could still feel them, lingering in my mind like a dark stain. I ran out of St. Agnes, slamming the door behind me, but as I did, I thought I heard one final whisper. "We'll be waiting." I never went back, but that didn't stop them from following me. Late at night, when the world is silent, I still hear the whispers, scratching at the edges of my mind. I see shadows moving in my room, faces staring at me from the darkness, their hollow eyes filled with accusation. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel a hand on my shoulder, cold as ice, and hear the doctor's voice echoing from the depths of St. Agnes. "You're one of us now." The Willowcrest Asylum had been closed for 50 years, and yet the rumors about what went on inside its walls were enough to keep people far away. Stories spread through town of doctors who experimented on their patients, treating them like lab rats, pushing them past the breaking point. It was said that those who died within those walls never left. The townspeople claimed the spirits of the tortured patients haunted Willowcrest, trapped in endless torment. But my friends and I were fascinated. A strange kind of thrill always pushed us to the edges of the places we were told to avoid. One dark November night, we decided to break into Willowcrest. Our plan was to explore, take photos, and maybe catch a glimpse of the legendary hauntings for ourselves. As we approached the building, a chill ran down my spine. The asylum loomed before us, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring us down. We climbed through a broken window, landing in what must have once been a patient waiting area. The walls were cracked and peeling, covered in strange, dark stains that made the air smell of something rancid and old. It felt like the building was holding its breath, waiting. Inside, it was dead silent. The air was heavy, thick with the feeling that we were not alone. We walked through the dim corridors, our flashlights barely breaking through the darkness. The sound of our footsteps echoed off the walls, and with each step, my heart beat a little faster. We made our way to the patient wing. Rooms lined the hallway, doors ajar, each one hiding shadows that seemed to move if you looked at them too long. On the wall, a black and white photo of the asylum staff hung crooked. The nurses and doctors were expressionless, their eyes cold and unsettling. My friend Derek joked that they looked like they could still be here, watching us from the shadows. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from down the hall, shattering the silence. We all froze, staring at each other, our hearts pounding. "Probably just an animal," Derek whispered, but none of us believed it. Still, we pushed on, driven by a mix of fear and the thrill of the unknown. As we continued down the hall, we heard faint whispers, like a conversation in the distance. The sound was too low to make out words, but the voices were desperate, pleading. We stopped and listened, holding our breaths. I felt a strange pull, like the voices were drawing me in, beckoning me to follow. Without thinking, I stepped toward one of the rooms at the end of the hall. Inside, I found an old, rusted hospital bed in the center of the room, with leather straps attached to the sides. The straps were stained with something dark, and the walls were covered in deep scratch marks, as though someone had clawed at them in a frenzy. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second I thought I saw a figure lying on the bed, thrashing against the restraints, mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, gasping, and the figure vanished, but something else remained. A faint whisper that seemed to come from the bed itself, begging, pleading, asking for someone to help. The voice was soft but desperate, full of pain. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to my friends, but they were looking past me, their eyes wide with horror. I turned to see what they were staring at and felt the blood drain from my face. In the doorway of the room next to us stood a tall figure in an old-fashioned doctor's coat, his face obscured by shadows. He stood perfectly still, but his presence felt like a black hole, sucking the warmth and light out of the room. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, cold and piercing, boring into me. He raised a hand, pointing down the hall, beckoning us deeper into the asylum. We ran. Heart pounding, I could hear the sound of footsteps following us, relentless and heavy. No matter how fast we went, the footsteps grew closer, echoing in the darkness. I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder, fingers that felt too long and sharp, and I screamed. Derek led us down a narrow staircase to the basement, hoping to find another way out, but the basement was worse than anything we'd seen so far. The walls were lined with rusted cages, like some sort of medieval dungeon. Inside each cage were remnants, frayed clothes, faded hospital tags, even a few old, cracked dolls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something far more putrid like rotting flesh. We didn't have time to search for an exit. The doctor's footsteps echoed down the staircase, unhurried but purposeful, like he knew we had nowhere to go. In the dim light, we saw movement, shadows inside the cages, shifting, writhing, reaching out to us. They were patients, or at least the spirits of patients, their faces twisted in agony, their hands clawing at the bars, reaching for us, pleading with hollow eyes. One of them, a young girl with matted hair and a sunken face, whispered, "He won't let us leave." Her words sent a chill down my spine, and as she reached out to grab my arm, I felt her cold skeletal fingers brush against my skin. Her grip tightened, and I couldn't move, my body frozen in terror. The doctor's footsteps grew louder, closer, and then they stopped. I looked up, and there he was, standing just feet away. His face was still obscured, but I could see his mouth now, a twisted, sickening smile that promised nothing but pain. In a flash, he moved, reaching for us with hands that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Derek grabbed my arm, breaking the girl's grip, and we bolted, ducking under his grasp and sprinting back up the stairs. The doctor's laughter echoed behind us, low and hollow, filling the building as we tore through the corridors, desperately searching for an exit. Finally, we burst through the main entrance and out into the cold night air, gasping, stumbling, barely able to breathe. We didn't stop running until we were far from Willowcrest, the doctor's laughter still ringing in our ears. To this day, I can't get that place out of my mind. I still hear the voices in my dreams, the whispers of patients pleading for help, the doctor's sinister laugh echoing in the darkness. And sometimes in the dead of night, I feel a cold hand on my shoulder, and I hear the young girl's voice whispering in my ear. He won't let us leave. I don't know if we escaped that night, or if part of us is still trapped there, lost forever in the halls of Willowcrest Asylum, waiting to join the tortured souls that haunt its dark, endless corridors. The small town of Black Hollow had long been haunted by the legend of Redmere Sanitarium. It was a crumbling old building deep in the woods, nearly forgotten, except for the stories locals told about the Redmere patients, souls left behind to wander in endless misery. As the story went, Redmere had once been a place for the incurables, patients deemed too mentally disturbed for normal treatment. Those who entered its halls were rarely heard from again. It was said that the doctors conducted unspeakable experiments in the name of science and buried the evidence when they abandoned the asylum, leaving everything and everyone behind. One autumn evening, I decided to investigate the sanitarium with my friend Mia. We were both skeptics, and though the stories were terrifying, we couldn't shake the excitement of discovering the truth ourselves. Armed with flashlights and a camera, we made our way to Redmere as the sun sank behind the dense trees. As we stepped inside, the cold hit us immediately, an unnatural chill that seemed to wrap around us. The walls were lined with faded, stained wallpaper that peeled in long strips, and the smell was putrid, as though something had decayed and never left. We could barely see through the thick dust, which swirled around us with every step, catching the light of our flashlights. The first room we entered was a recreation area, with abandoned, rusted wheelchairs and broken toys scattered across the floor. In the corner, a child's rocking chair creaked back and forth, moving slowly as if someone had just left it. I aimed my flashlight at it, trying to convince myself it was a draft. But the air was still, and the silence felt heavy, almost alive. We kept moving, each creak of the floor sounding louder than the last. Down one hall, we found a series of old patient rooms, each one smaller and darker than the last. In one of them, a single cot lay against the wall, its sheets torn and filthy. On the walls, strange symbols had been scratched into the paint, too old to decipher but unmistakably desperate. Suddenly, Mia froze beside me, grabbing my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I strained to listen and heard a faint scratching coming from one of the rooms down the hall. It was a slow, persistent sound, like someone dragging their nails against the wall. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I looked down the dim corridor, but the room where the sound was coming from was pitch black. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, though I didn't believe it. We walked toward the sound, each step taking longer than the last. When we reached the room, Mia took a shaky breath and opened the door. Inside, in the corner, was a figure huddled against the wall, scratching at the peeling wallpaper with bony fingers. Her hair was long, dark, and matted, and she wore a tattered hospital gown, stained and torn. She didn't seem to notice us, just kept scratching, mumbling something we couldn't understand. "Hello?" Mia called out softly. The figure stopped. Slowly she turned, her head moving in a jerky, unnatural way, her eyes wide and glassy, fixed on some point far beyond us. Her mouth opened slightly, and a low, hoarse voice drifted out. "He's coming. He's coming for you." In a flash, she lunged toward us, her arms outstretched, eyes wild with terror. We stumbled back, slamming the door shut as her shrill scream echoed down the hall. Heart pounding, I grabbed Mia's arm and we ran, her panicked breaths loud in the silence. The hallways twisted and turned, and every door we passed seemed to open slightly as if inviting us in. We rounded a corner and found ourselves in a large, dim room filled with metal gurneys. On each one lay what looked like the outline of a body covered by filthy sheets. I approached one of the gurneys, my hands shaking, and gently lifted the corner of the sheet. Beneath it was a mannequin, its face twisted in a silent scream, its hands locked in a grip of terror. But as I looked closer, I noticed that the mannequin's eyes seemed real, staring up at me, pleading. I dropped the sheet, feeling bile rise in my throat. Before we could leave, the door at the far end of the room creaked open. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. He wore a doctor's coat, smeared with dark stains, and his face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes glinted, cold and cruel. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and hollow. "You're interrupting my treatment." He stepped forward, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost like he was gliding. Panic overtook us, and we scrambled backwards, knocking over trays of old, rusty medical tools that clattered to the floor. The doctor's face twisted into a dark smile, and he lifted a finger to his lips, shushing us. In the silence, we could hear faint voices echoing around us, cries of pain and pleas for mercy. They came from every direction, growing louder, as though the walls themselves were screaming. The doctor tilted his head, watching us with an unsettling curiosity, as though we were part of some sick experiment he was planning. He took another step forward, and Mia bolted, pulling me with her. We raced down the hallways, desperately trying to find our way out, but every corner seemed to take us further into the heart of the asylum. Doors creaked open as we passed, and in each one, shadowy figures reached out, their faces hollow, their hands clawing at the air as if begging us to help them escape. Finally, we found the staircase leading back to the entrance. Just as we reached it, I felt a cold, bony hand grip my shoulder. I turned, and the woman we'd seen earlier stood inches from my face, her eyes wide with fear. "He's watching you," she whispered, her breath freezing on my skin. "He always watches, and he always finds you." With a scream, I broke free and sprinted up the stairs, Mia right behind me. We burst out of the building and into the night, gasping, our breath visible in the cold air. But even outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that the doctor's hollow eyes were still on us. We didn't speak on the drive home, our minds reeling from what we'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep, haunted by visions of the doctor's face, the pleading eyes of the mannequins, and the hollow, despairing figures reaching for us from the shadows. But it didn't end there. In the nights that followed, I would wake in the middle of the night to a sound just outside my door, a faint scratching like fingernails against wood. Sometimes I heard a low, whispering voice, the doctor's voice, telling me I was overdue for my treatment. And every night, as I lay awake in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back from Redmere Sanitarium, that a part of me was still trapped in its cold, echoing halls. Or worse, that something had followed me home. The old Mercy Pines Hospital stood on the outskirts of town, hidden by thick forests and heavy mist that never seemed to clear. It was abandoned years ago, but the stories about the horrors that happened within those walls were as alive as ever. Mercy Pines had once been a haven for the ill, but somewhere along the way it became something darker, a place where the boundaries between life and death seemed to blur. I had heard the stories growing up, nurses who vanished without a trace, patients who appeared in their families' homes after death, claiming they had checked themselves out of the hospital. Rumors claimed that Mercy Pines was cursed, a place that no one could ever truly leave. When my friend Kevin dared me to spend a night there, I couldn't resist. Part of me wanted to prove the stories wrong, but deep down, I knew there was something sinister waiting in that place. We arrived at Mercy Pines just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving us in eerie twilight. The hospital loomed in front of us, dark windows like hollow eyes. The main entrance was open, almost inviting, and as we stepped inside, the cold settled around us like a shroud. The interior was even worse than I imagined. Hallways stretched on endlessly, littered with forgotten hospital equipment, gurneys, and old patient charts scattered across the floor. Every step we took echoed down the halls, bouncing back at us with strange, unnatural clarity. Kevin laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but there was a heaviness in the air that made us both fall silent. We ventured into the ICU wing, a place that supposedly housed the worst cases. The rooms here were different. The beds were bolted to the floor, and thick leather straps hung from the sides as if meant to restrain someone or something that needed to be kept under control. The walls were scratched, bearing deep gouges as if someone had clawed at them, desperate to escape. Kevin shone his flashlight down the hall, stopping abruptly when he saw a room at the end with its door closed. It was odd, given that every other door we'd passed was wide open. A nameplate on the door read Patient 105. Curiosity got the better of us, and we moved toward it. As we got closer, an overwhelming smell filled the air, like rotting flesh and antiseptic, a stench so foul it made us gag. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking, and opened the door. Inside was a hospital bed, neatly made, with a patient chart lying on the pillow. The walls in this room were pristine, untouched, as if the years hadn't touched this place. Kevin picked up the chart, frowning as he flipped through the pages. It was full of handwritten notes describing bizarre symptoms, extreme hallucinations, uncontrollable screaming, unexplained injuries. The last page had a single sentence scrawled in red ink: "Do not let him leave." Suddenly, we heard footsteps echoing down the hall. Kevin and I turned off our flashlights, holding our breaths as the sound grew closer. The footsteps were slow and shuffling like someone dragging their feet. The air became even colder each met, and I felt an intense, oppressive presence, as if we were being watched. I glanced at Kevin, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. A figure emerged from the darkness, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man in a patient gown, his skin a sickly gray, his eyes hollow and sunken, staring straight ahead as he shuffled down the hall. His face was blank, expressionless, but there was something deeply unsettling about him. His mouth hung open slightly, and with every step, a low, raspy breath escaped him. We backed into patient 105's room, shutting the door quietly behind us. We pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to stay silent as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a few agonizing moments, there was only silence. Then, the door handle began to turn slowly, and a faint whisper drifted through the door. "Let me out." The voice was weak, barely audible, but it was full of pain, an endless, soul-crushing despair. We held our breaths, gripping each other as the handle turned again, but the door didn't open. Slowly, the footsteps retreated, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. We waited, our hearts pounding, before daring to step out into the hallway. The figure was gone, but a dark stain had appeared on the floor where he had been standing. It was black, like blood mixed with something thicker, more sinister, and it seemed to spread, inching toward us as we stared. "We need to leave," I whispered, pulling Kevin along. But as we turned back toward the entrance, the hallway stretched out endlessly, much longer than had been when we entered. Door after door lined the corridor, each marked with different patient numbers, none of which we remembered seeing before. We walked quickly, then broke into a run, but no matter how far we went, the hallway stretched on, pulling us deeper into the hospital. Then, all the doors opened at once. From each room, figures emerged, pale and ghostly, patients dressed in hospital gowns, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They shuffled into the hallway, forming a line on either side, watching us with vacant stares as we passed. Their mouths moved, whispering words I couldn't understand, their voices blending into a chilling, otherworldly chorus. One figure stepped forward, blocking our path. It was the man we had seen earlier, the one with the gray skin and hollow eyes. He reached out to me with a skeletal hand, his fingers cold as ice as they brushed against my arm. His touch felt like a burning brand, and a searing pain shot through me as he leaned closer, his lips inches from my ear. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice like nails scraping against metal. "Now you belong to Mercy Pines." I pulled away, screaming, and Kevin and I bolted, our only thought to escape. But as we ran, the building seemed to close in around us. The walls tightened, and every door we passed slammed shut. The whispers grew louder, filling my head, drowning out my thoughts. I felt myself slowing, my legs growing heavy as though something was dragging me back. Finally, we saw the front doors just ahead, still open, and we sprinted toward them with every ounce of strength we had left. As we burst through them, a final scream echoed behind us, a howl of rage and despair that seemed to shake the very ground. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, breathless and shaking, too terrified to look back. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, a shadow that lingered just out of sight, watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the faint, raspy whisper of the man from Mercy Pines, calling from somewhere deep within my mind. "Let me out! Let me out!" The abandoned Crestwood Children's Hospital stood like a dark sentinel at the edge of town. Closed for decades, it had a sinister reputation that kept locals far away. Though it had been built to help children with long-term illnesses, the hospital's practices soon took a disturbing turn. Rumor had it that Dr. Hartley, the head pediatrician, was obsessed with experimenting on the young patients, running inhumane tests in his quest for a cure. Some said he had devised a way to trap the children's souls within the hospital, condemning them to an endless state of suffering. When the hospital abruptly closed, all the patients simply disappeared. My friends and I had grown up with the stories, but as skeptics, we wanted to see the place for ourselves. We dared each other to spend the night inside, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever haunted Crestwood. With flashlights in hand, we arrived just before midnight, creeping through the rusted gate that groaned as we forced it open. The chill in the air was immediate, unnatural, as if the hospital itself exhaled in anticipation. Inside, the silence was deafening, thick with an eerie weight. Faded murals of smiling animals and cheerful landscapes lined the walls, mocking the horror that reportedly took place here. A pile of children's toys sat abandoned in a corner. Dolls with vacant eyes, a worn teddy bear missing one arm, a red ball that seemed eerily clean amid the dust. The building was dark, and our flashlights barely pierced the blackness. As we explored, our footsteps echoed down the long corridors, each one lined with tiny, empty rooms. The hospital layout was a confusing maze, with twisting hallways that led to strange dead ends and locked doors. There were rooms filled with medical equipment that looked more like medieval torture devices, tools I couldn't even identify, their metal surfaces covered in rust and dark stains that I tried not to think about. We soon found ourselves near what appeared to be the children's ward. The door marked Pediatric Special Treatments. I felt a chill as I pushed it open, revealing rows of small beds. The room was even colder than the hallways, and a faint humming sound buzzed from the walls, like electricity flickering to life, though we knew the hospital had been disconnected from power years ago. A thin layer of dust covered each bed, except for one in the corner, where the sheets were oddly pristine, as though someone had just been lying there. As I approached, I noticed something even stranger, a set of small footprints leading from the bed toward the wall. My friend Ellie moved her flashlight across the room, and it landed on a figure sitting in the far corner. It was a young boy, his head down, hands clasped tightly around his knees. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his hair fell in messy, unwashed clumps. He wore an old-fashioned hospital gown, and his frame seemed unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. We froze, staring, unsure whether he was real or some cruel trick our minds were playing on us. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The boy lifted his head, and I gasped. His eyes were hollow, dark voids with no hint of life, yet they locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. Slowly, he pointed to the door, his finger trembling. "He's coming," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "You need to hide." Before we could process what he said, the temperature plummeted. A loud metallic screech echoed down the hallway, like a gurney being dragged across the floor, the sound getting closer with each passing second. The boy's face twisted in terror, and he dissolved into the shadows, vanishing before our eyes. Panic set in, and we ran, searching for any place to hide. We ducked into a storage closet, pressing ourselves against the wall as the sound grew louder. Through a crack in the door, I could see the hallway dimly illuminated by our flashlight beams still lying where we had dropped them. Shadows danced wildly across the walls, and then he appeared. A tall figure moved through the hall, dressed in a long, stained doctor's coat. His face was obscured by a surgical mask, but his eyes were fierce, burning with a malicious glee. He wheeled an old metal cart with straps dangling from its sides, a scalpel clutched in one hand. Every few steps he would stop, as if listening, his head tilting toward the rooms as he passed, searching. We held our breath, praying he wouldn't hear us. Just as he was about to pass, he froze, his head snapping toward the closet. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his scalpel glinting in the dim light. A faint, sickly sweet smell filled the air like antiseptic mixed with rot. He reached for the doorknob, twisting it slowly, and I felt my heart stop. But before he could open it, a sound echoed from down the hall, a faint, childlike giggle. The doctor froze, his body tense, and then he turned, moving toward the sound with a strange eagerness, dragging the cart behind him. We slipped out of the closet, our eyes darting around for an exit. But before we could make it back down the hall, a voice, soft and breathy, whispered in my ear, "Help me." I turned to see a little girl standing beside me, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. She reached out, clutching my wrist with icy fingers, her grip so tight I couldn't pull away. Her skin was paper thin, revealing dark veins beneath, and her eyes, they were filled with the most profound terror I had ever seen. "He's coming back," she whispered, glancing down the hall. "He never lets us leave. He wants us to stay. Forever." At that moment, a chill ran through the hallway, a sudden gust that made the lights flicker. A shadow stretched along the walls, the doctor returning, moving swiftly and silently. We tore away from the little girl, sprinting down the hall as the doctor's footsteps grew louder behind us, his laughter echoing through the empty halls. We finally found an exit door, slamming into it with all our weight, and burst into the cold night air, stumbling and gasping. Behind us, the hospital seemed to shudder, its dark windows watching us, the laughter fading into the distance. But as we made our way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. When I looked over my shoulder, I thought I caught a glimpse of a small figure standing in the shadows, watching me with empty eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doctor's twisted smile and heard the children's whispers, begging for help. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear them. A faint giggle, the whisper of small feet padding along the hallway, and a voice, soft and desperate, whispering in the darkness. He'll come for you too. He never lets anyone leave. Years after it closed, St. Augustine Asylum still cast a sinister shadow over the town. Locals had always claimed it was haunted. Rumors circulated about Dr. Calloway, the last director of the asylum, who was said to have conducted sadistic experiments on the most vulnerable patients. One by one, they disappeared, never to be heard from again. When the asylum was finally shuttered, Dr. Calloway vanished as well, leaving behind unanswered questions and a building steeped in a chilling, haunted silence. I was an amateur paranormal investigator, and I had a fascination with places like St. Augustine. When I learned that there was a way into the old asylum, I couldn't resist the chance to explore. Two friends, Jake and Sam, reluctantly agreed to join me, though they made me promise it would be quick. We arrived at midnight, the massive, decaying structure looming before us. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The entry was blocked, but a broken window on the first floor offered us access. Inside, we found ourselves in a vast lobby, the walls covered in layers of peeling paint, the floors littered with broken furniture and hospital equipment. As we moved down the halls, a thick fog seemed to settle over the building, muffling our footsteps. Each corridor felt like it went on forever, the doors to the patient rooms yawning open, leading into darkness. Every so often, we would hear faint whispers echoing through the halls, too quiet to make out, as if a group of people were murmuring just out of reach. I turned a corner and saw a door marked Observation Room. Curiosity piqued. I stepped inside. The room was small, with a large two-way mirror covering one wall, looking into the adjacent room. Dust covered every surface, and a single chair stood in the corner. But what held my attention was the faint outline of a handprint on the mirror, pressed against the glass from the other side. "Look at this," I whispered to Jake and Sam, pointing to the handprint. Jake frowned, running his flashlight over it. "Must be from the last patient, or one of those kids who break in here for thrills." But deep down, I knew that handprint was far too old, too desperate. We moved on, heading deeper into the asylum, and soon found ourselves near the basement stairwell. This part of the asylum felt different, colder, as though the air itself had turned hostile. Against my better judgment, I suggested we go down. Jake and Sam hesitated, but something about that dark stairway pulled me forward, and they reluctantly followed. The basement was pitch black, the walls damp with mold, and something darker, something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The faint sound of shuffling feet echoed somewhere in the distance, but every time we stopped to listen, the sound vanished. I tried to shake off the feeling that we were being watched, but it only grew stronger. Down one hall, we found a room labeled Patient Records. The door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing shelves filled with dust-covered files. Sam opened one at random, his face paling as he read. This isn't right," he stammered. "It says the patients were subjected to deprivation tanks, days without food or light. They were studying the effects of absolute isolation." He flipped through another file, his hands shaking. Some of them, they were left in their rooms for months at a time. A sharp clang rang out behind us, like metal striking stone. We spun around, but the hall was empty. I was about to close the file cabinet when I noticed a handwritten note tucked between two files. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "He watches the halls. Don't let him see you alone." "Let's get out of here," Jake muttered, his voice barely a whisper. We stumbled down the hall, heading for the stairs, but as we passed an empty room, something caught my eye. It was an iron bed, bolted to the floor, and on it lay a tattered straitjacket, the straps broken as though someone had struggled against them. Just as I looked away, I thought I saw a figure lying there, a flickering outline, pale and skeletal, bound in the jacket and thrashing. I blinked, and it was gone. The panic set in then, clawing at my chest. I had come here looking for a thrill, but this was different. It felt like the asylum itself was alive, drawing us deeper. We started to run, and as we reached the stairwell, Jake froze, his eyes fixed on something at the top of the stairs. "What is that?" he whispered. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. At the top of the stairs stood a figure, tall and shadowy, cloaked in darkness. He wore a doctor's coat, but his face was obscured by shadows. A faint light glinted off his round, wire-rimmed glasses, and his head was tilted ever so slightly, as if he were studying us with dark curiosity. His fingers, unnaturally long and thin, tapped rhythmically against his thigh, each tap echoing down the stairwell like a countdown. We backed away, but the figure didn't move. He only watched, his head tilting from side to side as though savoring our fear. Jake took a step back, and a flicker of satisfaction seemed to cross the figure's hidden face. A low, rasping voice filled the air, though his lips didn't move. "You're too late. Once you've entered, you can't leave." Suddenly, every light in the basement hallway flickered on, casting harsh, unnatural light across the floor, revealing rows of shadows. More figures, patients dressed in ragged gowns, faces blank and twisted, standing shoulder to shoulder down the corridor. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, and their empty eyes followed our every movement. Panicked, we sprinted back down the hall, looking for any other way out. As we turned a corner, we found ourselves at another stairwell, this one leading up. Without thinking, we scrambled up the stairs, hearing the footsteps of those phantom figures close behind us. We finally burst through a door into a darkened room. It looked like a doctor's office, the furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. But the air was thick, stifling, as if it were pressing down on us. I noticed an old journal on the floor and picked it up, flipping through the pages. The last entry read, "The doctor is watching. Once he finds you, he never lets go. The patients scream because they know he'll never let them leave." At that moment, a loud creak sounded behind us. We turned to see Dr. Calloway standing in the doorway, his face finally visible, thin and twisted into an unnatural grin. His eyes were cold and soulless, shining with an almost gleeful malice. He stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the room, swallowing us in darkness. We bolted out of the office, somehow finding our way back to the main lobby. We could feel him following us, his presence pressing closer, suffocating. As we ran out of the asylum, I glanced back just once and saw Dr. Calloway standing in the doorway, his empty gaze fixed on me. We didn't stop running until we were miles from the asylum, but the feeling of his stare lingered. I thought we had escaped that night, but every so often, when I look into a dark room or glance at a shadow in the corner, I see a flicker of movement, a pale face with wire-rimmed glasses staring back at me, waiting. And I know he's still watching.